Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a journey into one of the most infamous psychological studies ever conducted. I want you to settle in, take a breath, and prepare yourself, because we're going to explore the darkest corners of human nature. This isn't just a review of academic data. It's a profound, unsettling look at what happens when ordinary people are placed in extraordinary, suffocating systems of power. Our story begins here, August 14th, 1971. We aren't looking at a sprawling Gothic penitentiary. It's just a simple, windowless basement corridor in Jordan Hall, deep within Stanford University. Through a few makeshift walls and barred doors, an academic psychology department was transformed into a claustrophobic, isolated world. It was in this incredibly stark, quiet physical space that 24 completely ordinary lives were about to drastically and painfully change. Before we go any further, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to really think about it. If a random coin toss decided your fate, decided whether you were the one holding the keys or the one locked behind the bars, what side would you land on? And more importantly, how would that simple flip of a coin change who you are? Part 1, the setup and the flip. Okay, let's dive right into how this simulation began, because its completely mundane start makes what followed all the more terrifying. It all kicked off with this simple newspaper ad, placed by Stanford psychology professor Philip Zimbardo in the Palo Alto Times. Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. The pay was $15 a day. That was a pretty decent wage for a college student back in 1971. Over 70 young men answered this ad, expecting nothing more than a harmless, maybe slightly boring way to make some quick summer cash. Out of those 70 applicants, Zimbardo's team carefully screened and selected 24. Now, what is absolutely crucial to understand here is who these young men were. They were college students from middle-class backgrounds. They were rigorously tested and found to be psychologically healthy and highly stable. They had no criminal records. They had no history of violence. I really want you to sit with that fact for a moment. These were perfectly healthy, normal young men. They were not bad people. Not before this started, anyway. So the 24 men were divided into two groups, prisoners and guards. And how is this monumental decision made? A literal flip of a coin. It was entirely arbitrary. The men who became guards were given absolutely zero formal training on how to actually be correctional officers. They were simply handed a baton, given a khaki uniform, and told to maintain order without using physical violence. Imagine yourself standing in that basement. That coin flip could have gone either way for any one of them. It could have gone either way for you. Part 2, the immersion. Day 1 is the moment the simulation stopped feeling like a quirky summer job and suddenly felt incredibly, terrifyingly real. It began with the systematic dissolving of human identity. Real Palo Alto police officers, who were actually cooperating with Zimbardo, arrested the designated prisoners at their real homes, right in front of their neighbors. They were handcuffed, blindfolded, and driven to the Stanford basement with sirens wailing. Upon arrival, they were stripped naked and sprayed with delousing powder. They were issued uncomfortable, ill-fitting smocks with ID numbers sewn on the front and back. Their names were erased. They were now only numbers. And finally, a heavy, lockable chain was bolted around one ankle. Step by step, piece by piece, their former selves were stripped away. This brutal process triggered a phenomenon psychologists call de-individuation. It's this terrifying state where you become so immersed in a role or a group that your personal identity and your sense of individual responsibility just simply vanish. And this didn't just happen to the prisoners in their smocks. The guards were issued matching khaki uniforms and reflective mirrored sunglasses. Those sunglasses weren't just a cool costume choice. They were calculated tools, specifically designed to prevent eye contact, to block out empathy, and to strip away their own humanity, making it infinitely easier for them to view the prisoners not as peers, but as cattle. Part 3, the escalation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing just how fast the guards embraced their unchecked authority and how quickly the basement descended into absolute chaos. Notice the rapid acceleration of the timeline here. Day 1 was actually pretty quiet. Everyone was just awkwardly feeling out their new roles. But on the morning of day 2, the prisoners unexpectedly rebelled, barricading themselves inside their cells. The guards, suddenly feeling their authority threatened, crushed the rebellion by blasting the prisoners with skin-chilling carbon dioxide from fire extinguishers. By day 3, the guards were inventing arbitrary, psychological punishments that Zimbardo never asked for and never trained them to use. They forced prisoners to do endless push-ups, they stripped their beds, and literally took away their mattresses. They conducted arbitrary, blaring head counts in the middle of the night, completely depriving the prisoners of sleep. Years later, one of the guards reflected on his actions with this truly chilling quote: "Acting authoritatively can be fun. Power can be a great pleasure." I want you to let that linger for a second. Nobody explicitly ordered these young men to invent middle-of-the-night head counts. Nobody forced them to take away the prisoners' mattresses. They built this architecture of cruelty themselves, escalating it day by agonizing day. This escalation was really spearheaded by a specific guard, the prisoners nicknamed John Wayne. He was a participant named Dave Eschliman, who consciously modeled his cruel Southern accent persona on a movie villain from the film Cool Hand Luke. Eschliman later admitted that he was treating the experiment almost like an acting improvisation. He was actively trying to force the action. He was deliberately pushing the boundaries, testing exactly how far he could go, how cruel he could be, before someone, anyone, stepped in to stop him. But no one did. Part 4, the breaking point. The psychological weight quickly became utterly unbearable for everyone involved. Less than 36 hours into the simulation, prisoner 8612, a young man named Douglas Corby, completely broke down. Locked in a dark closet that was serving as solitary confinement, he began screaming furiously. I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside. I can't stand another night. I just can't take it anymore. This audio recording became the ultimate, iconic symbol of the profound agony the Stanford Prison Experiment inflicted on its subjects. But years later, a fascinating complexity emerged. We really have to look at both sides of the coin here. On one hand, the environment was genuinely brutal. The claustrophobia, the sleep deprivation, the endless humiliation, they were absolutely crushing. But on the other hand, Douglas Corby later confessed in interviews with journalist Ben Blum that his dramatic breakdown was actually a bit of a sham. He admitted to faking the hysteria because he desperately needed to leave the basement to study for his graduate school exams, and the researchers had refused his requests for his books. We want to present both realities honestly here in this explainer. The environment was undeniably traumatizing, yet the suffering was sometimes deeply tangled with performative desperation. Both things can be true at once, and that complexity is what makes this story so compelling. But the prisoners weren't the only ones who lost themselves in the basement. Philip Zimbardo himself lost the thread. He stopped acting as an objective research psychologist and appointed himself the prison superintendent. He was personally negotiating with a mock parole board and losing complete track of where the experiment ended and his own reality began. It wasn't until his girlfriend, a recent Stanford PhD named Christina Moslak, came down to the basement on day 5. She saw the haggard prisoners in the corridor, she saw the guards' behavior, and she was absolutely horrified. She looked at Zimbardo and said, "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys." Her moral clarity finally snapped Zimbardo out of his trance. He abruptly ended the 2-week study the very next morning on day 6. Part 5, the modern reckoning. A lot of time has passed since 1971, and we must now deconstruct the famous myth that surrounds this experiment. For decades, the story was that these guards naturally, spontaneously turned into sadists. But modern findings by investigative journalists like Ben Blum and academics like Thibault Letexier have really complicated that narrative. They combed through the Stanford archives and found audio recordings of the research staff actively steering the results. In one recording, David Jaffe, an undergraduate researcher acting as the warden, explicitly coaches a hesitant guard. He tells him, the guards have to know that every guard is going to be what we call a tough guard. So the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the difference between the myth and the documented reality. The myth that made this study globally famous is that ordinary people spontaneously turn evil the second they are given power and a uniform. But the reality is that the guards were heavily coached, directed, and subtly encouraged toward cruelty by the experimenters who wanted dramatic results. Now, this doesn't erase the terrible things that happened in that basement. The environment absolutely pushed people toward cruelty. But we have to state plainly that the story became far more dramatic in the retelling than the historical documents actually support. To put this into perspective, consider the 2002 BBC prison study. Psychologists attempted a modern replication of the Stanford setup, but this time with strict ethical guardrails and absolutely no coaching from the researchers. The results were the exact opposite. The guards felt extremely uncomfortable using their power and hesitated to act, while the prisoners quickly organized collectively and challenged the guards' authority. This brilliantly illustrates that the tragic descent witnessed at Stanford wasn't some inevitable, inescapable flaw of human nature. Part 6, the legacy. As we wrap up, we need to step back and connect the threads of this explainer to the broader, much darker realities of human history. The Stanford basement is just one piece of a much larger puzzle regarding the architecture of obedience. Stanley Milgram's famous shock experiments showed us obedience to direct authority from above, someone in a lab coat saying continue. But Stanford showed us something perhaps even scarier: cruelty invented from below. Cruelty fueled simply by a role, a uniform, and the terrifying knowledge that nobody is watching closely enough to stop you. From the Stanford basement to the horrific abuses at Abu Ghraib and tragedies like the Rana Plaza Collapse, we see what happens when vast systems treat human beings as nothing more than replaceable numbers. So I leave you with this final thought. If you were given a badge and told to maintain order with absolutely nobody watching, what would you become? The honest answer is, you don't know. Neither did they. Thank you for watching Dark Chronicles.